The ballroom noticed him before he noticed the ballroom. That was the thing nobody talked about afterward. Not the cameras, not the 3 men at the bar, not the event coordinator who had triple-checked the guest list twice that evening. They all saw Arthur Kemp walk through those doors and felt something shift. The way a room shifts when someone enters who doesn't know the unspoken rules and therefore hasn't bothered to follow them. He was 43. He had a jaw that looked like it had been through something and come out the other side still standing. He wore dark slacks and a white dress shirt. No jacket, no tie. Sleeves rolled to the elbow. Every other man in the Harrington Hotel's grand ballroom that evening wore a blazer at minimum. Several wore full evening dress. The event, billed as a Distinguished Professionals Gala, had a suggested attire guideline printed on the invitation in italics, and Arthur Kemp had apparently read right past it. He stood at the entrance for exactly 3 seconds, taking in the chandeliers, the white tablecloths, the ice sculpture near the east wall that depicted something meant to be a swan but looked more like a goose having a difficult night. Then he adjusted the lanyard with his name badge, squared his shoulders, and walked in like he'd paid for the building. He had, in a way. The gala was a fundraiser for the Millbrook Community Health Initiative. Arthur was a physical therapist who ran a free weekend clinic out of the church on Dunmore Street. He'd been nominated by the board without his knowledge and told about it 2 weeks ago by a letter he almost threw away. He'd almost skipped entirely. His daughter had made him go. "You never leave the apartment on weekends," she'd said, standing in his kitchen, pulling expired soup cans from with the energy of someone performing a rescue operation. "You make coffee. You watch the game. You fall asleep before halftime. You need to be around actual humans, Dad." "I'm around humans all week," he'd said. Patience don't count. He hadn't known how to argue with that, so there he was. No jacket. Name badge slightly crooked. Scanning a ballroom full of people who had dressed for an occasion he hadn't quite understood was an occasion. The bar was along the north wall, dark mahogany, backlit bottles, 3 stools occupied by men who had clearly arrived together and were not planning to move. Arthur clocked them without meaning to. 2 were in their late 30s, hair product doing considerable work. The third was older, silver at the temples, the kind of man who wore his watch on the outside of his cuff. They were watching Arthur with the particular expression of people who have decided something about someone before that someone has opened their mouth. Arthur looked away first, not from discomfort, more from disinterest. He'd spent 20 years in physical therapy. He knew what people looked like when they were performing versus when they were present. Those 3 were performing for each other, had been performing all evening, and nothing about Arthur Kemp was going to interrupt that show. He found a waiter, got a glass of water with lemon because he didn't drink anymore. Hadn't in 8 years, a decision he'd made the morning after his wife's funeral when he'd realized he'd gotten through the service by being barely present, and he hadn't wanted to be barely present ever again, and he started making his way around the room. He knew almost no one. He recognized a city councilwoman he'd voted for and a hospital administrator he'd referred patients to, and he had brief, adequate conversations with both of them. He smiled when smiling was appropriate. He answered questions about his clinic with honesty and without performance. Yes, it was hard to fund. Yes, weekends were long. No, he didn't mind. He had the Sundays. What he didn't say was that the Sundays were the only thing keeping him sharp, that the rest of the week, the scheduled appointments, the insurance forms, the commute, was competent and hollow in a way he'd stopped noticing until his daughter held up a soup can with an expiration date of 3 years ago and looked at him with something close to alarm. He was fine. He was functioning. There's a very wide valley between those 2 things, and Arthur had been living in it for a while without examining it too closely. He'd gotten halfway around the room when he saw her. She was seated alone at a round table near the windows. 6 chairs, 5 empty, the centerpiece of white roses slightly too tall to see over comfortably. She was somewhere in her early 60s, though she held herself in a way that made age feel like an irrelevant category. Silver hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck, a deep blue dress, reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose over a small notepad on which she appeared to be writing something. In a room full of people actively performing the act of networking, she was the only person not performing anything. Her name badge said, Eleanor Marsh. Below the name, in smaller text, retired. Board member, Millbrook Health Initiative. The 5 empty chairs around her were not an accident. Arthur had been in enough rooms in his life to know the difference between a table that happened to have empty seats and a table that people were actively avoiding. It was subtle, a slight rerouting of foot traffic, a just slightly too long pause before choosing the next table over. Eleanor Marsh appeared not to notice, or had decided some time ago that noticing was optional. Arthur stood there a moment longer than he should have. From the bar, one of the silver-cuffed men said something quiet, and the other two laughed. Arthur didn't hear the words. He didn't need to. He crossed the room and stopped beside the empty chair 2 seats to Eleanor's left. "Is anyone sitting here?" he asked. She looked up over her glasses. She had the kind of eyes that had looked at a great many things and formed opinions about all of them. "Several people have walked past it," she said. None of them sat. "Then no," he said. "Then no," she agreed and returned to her notepad. He sat down. He set his water on the table. He didn't make a production of it. From the bar, there was silence. It lasted approximately 4 seconds before, louder this time, deliberately carrying, "Bold move for a guy who showed up in a work shirt." Arthur didn't turn around. Eleanor didn't look up from her notepad, but she set her pen down with the deliberate care of someone choosing not to respond to something. "Are you taking notes on the event?" Arthur asked. "I'm drafting a letter to our grant committee," she said. This seemed as efficient a use of the evening as any. "Does the grant committee know you're drafting their letter during the gala they funded?" Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. "They have not been informed." He almost smiled. "Arthur Kemp," he said. "I run the weekend clinic on Dunmore." "I know who you are," Eleanor said. "I was on the selection committee that nominated you. I voted for you. I almost didn't come. I know. We also received your RSVP, which was returned 3 days late with a coffee stain on it." He looked at her. She looked back at him, and this time the corner of her mouth went all the way. "Eleanor Marsh," she said, extending her hand. "I'm retired, which means I attend these things voluntarily and leave whenever I want. How long do you usually stay?" "Long enough to feel I've earned the donation I write on the way out. Tonight I'm recalibrating." "Because of the empty chairs?" She considered this. "Because of a number of things," she said. "The empty chairs are simply the most recent." She was not asking for sympathy. That was clear immediately. She had the affect of someone who had long since stopped requiring external validation for her emotional states and was simply describing the landscape. Arthur appreciated this in the way he appreciated clean diagnostic results. Useful information, no embellishment. He asked about the grant committee. She told him about the Millbrook Initiative's funding cycles, the gaps in coverage, the neighborhoods that kept sliding through. She was precise and unsentimental and knew the data better than anyone else at the event, which she knew without needing to say it. He asked good questions. She gave complete answers. The white roses sat between them doing their job, and the room continued to rotate around them, unconcerned. After a while, a waiter appeared with a bread basket, and they both took a roll without discussion, which felt oddly comfortable, the way small domestic gestures can feel comfortable when the larger conversation is already working. "You're not eating," she observed. "I'll eat when the dinner service comes. Are you always this patient?" "With food, yes. With other things, less so." "What other things?" He turned his water glass a quarter turn. "Insurance companies, bad weather in the middle of a volunteer shift, grown adults who know what they should be doing for their recovery and choose not to do it anyway. That last one must represent most of your week." "Most of my week," he agreed. "And then one of them walks in on a Tuesday 3 months later, walking correctly for the first time and impatient." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a very steady thing to live on." He hadn't thought of it that way before. He turned the phrase over in his mind. "What did you do?" he asked. "Before retired, I was a judge," she said. "Circuit court, 26 years. He nodded slowly. The precision, the unsentimental effect, the way she'd described the room, it all landed differently now, not that it changed anything. "Criminal? Family court, primarily, the last 9 years. He didn't say anything. Family court judges saw things that lived in them differently than they lived in other people. He knew this the way he knew things from patients who'd been through specific kinds of pain. There was a particular quality of steadiness in people who had witnessed the underside of ordinary life for long enough that they'd had to find a way to keep going through the afternoons. "That's a hard place to spend 9 years," he said. "Yes," she said simply. Not performing humility, not inviting further inquiry. Just yes. From the bar, the silver-cuffed man was telling a story. His voice carried more than he probably intended. It was a story about a golf course, and a deal, and a number that was supposed to land impressively. The two younger men laughed. The waiter, who happened to be standing nearby, kept his face very professionally empty. Eleanor glanced in that direction once, briefly, then returned. "Do you play golf?" she asked Arthur. "I do not. Tennis? No. What do you do with a free afternoon?" He thought about it honestly. "I fix things," he said. "I have a second-hand workbench in my second bedroom. I find broken things. Lamps, chairs, once a typewriter, and I figure out what's wrong with them. And then I fix them. Do you keep them sometimes? Mostly I donate them. My daughter says I have a compulsive need to restore function to things." Your daughter sounds perceptive. She is. She's also 24 and recently learned to do her own taxes, so she's at peak confidence right now. Eleanor smiled, a real one this time, not the corner of her mouth, but something fuller that changed her face. She had probably been a very striking woman at 40. She was still striking at whatever age she was now, though in the way things are striking when they've stopped trying to be. "I have a son," she said. "He's in Portland. He calls on Sundays and the calls last exactly as long as they need to." "That's a good arrangement. We have always been better at quality than quantity," she said. "His father and I set a bad example early on. All quantity, very little quality, and I think Thomas overcorrected. Is that a regret?" She seemed to consider whether to answer. "It's a fact I've made peace with," she said. "Regrets require a belief that different choices were available to a version of you that didn't yet have the information you needed to make them. I try not to operate on that assumption." The dinner service came. They ate and talked, and the conversation moved the way good conversations move. Not in a straight line, not toward any particular destination, but in widening circles that kept returning to the same center, which was something like, what does a life look like when the dramatic part is over and the important part hasn't quite announced itself yet? Arthur had not had a conversation like this in a long time. He had conversations at work, good ones, genuine ones, but shaped by purpose. He had conversations with his daughter that were full of love and slightly exhausting. He had conversations with his neighbor about the building's boiler situation. He had not had a conversation that moved in widening circles with someone who had no particular agenda for him in. He wasn't sure. He couldn't calculate it cleanly, and he decided not to try. At some point, the three men at the bar shifted, became two, became one, and eventually the bar was empty and Arthur had not noticed when it happened. At some point, the event coordinator announced the silent auction results, and there was polite applause, and Arthur and Eleanor both clapped without looking away from the conversation. At some point, Eleanor set her notepad on the table, closed, which was not a thing she had done for the entire evening, and Arthur noticed without commenting. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said. "You may try." "Why did you keep coming to these things?" he said. "After, whatever the after was. Why not just write the donation check and stay home?" Eleanor picked up her water glass and looked at it for a moment with the particular expression of someone choosing between several true answers. "Because staying home is a decision that gets easier every time you make it," she said. "And I watched myself making it, and I didn't like the trajectory." He understood that. He understood it precisely, in the way you understand something that describes your own life back to you in the vocabulary of someone else's experience. "I almost didn't come tonight," he said again. "I know, the coffee-stained RSVP. My daughter guilted me. Good daughters do that. She took expired soup cans out of my cabinet." Eleanor looked at him. "How expired? 3 years, Arthur, I know. That's not just not leaving the apartment. That's not checking the cabinet." "I know," he said. "I'm checking the cabinet now." She held his gaze for a moment, and what passed between them was not romantic in the traditional sense. It was something quieter and harder to name, which is what happens when two people who have been alone in their respective competencies recognize each other's specific kind of loneliness without either of them having to perform vulnerability about it. "The donation check I write on the way out." Eleanor said, is going to be larger than I originally planned. Because of the grant gap you mentioned. Because this was worth staying for, she said plainly. The gala wound down around them. Tables emptied. The goose swan ice sculpture developed a lean. The event coordinator began the process of looking simultaneously grateful and exhausted that marks the end of every fundraiser ever organized. Arthur and Eleanor did not rush. When the waiter came to collect the last of the settings, they were still talking about the Millbrook neighborhood's eastern corridor, about what changes in 20 years of family court looks like from inside it, about a typewriter Arthur had found at an estate sale that had turned out to be a 1952 Royal Quiet Deluxe with a stuck carriage return and perfect key tension once cleaned. I would have kept that one, Eleanor said. I did keep that one, he said. They stood at the same time without planning it, the way people do when a conversation has reached its natural resting point. In the lobby, waiting for their respective coats, Eleanor wrote something on a card from her wallet. One of those small personal cards people of a certain generation still carry, and handed it to him. The grant committee meets third Thursday of every month, she said. If you want to make the case for the Dunmore Clinic directly, I can arrange a seat at the table. He took the card. He looked at it. Her name, a phone number, an email address. He turned it over. The back was blank. I'll be there, he said. Bring documentation, she said. The committee responds to data. I have data. I know. I read your nomination file before I voted. She settled her coat around her shoulders, and something in the gesture was so entirely herself, unhurried, self-sufficient, requiring nothing from the moment, that he felt the particular quality of it in the way you feel something that is very good and has already half passed. Thank you, he said, for not minding that I sat down. She looked at him with those eyes that had formed opinions about a great many things. You're the only person tonight who sat down, she said. I noticed. Outside, the November air was cold and clean. Arthur Kemp stood on the steps of the Harrington Hotel for a moment before walking to his car, the card in his pocket, the city doing its late evening things around him. Taxis, a couple walking fast against the cold, the lights of the buildings doing what city lights do in November, which is remind you that other people are also in there, living in their own lit rectangles, making their own decisions about soup cans and RSVP deadlines and which empty chairs to sit down in. He got home at 11:17. He checked the cabinet under the sink, found 2 more expired cans he hadn't noticed, threw them away, and made a note on his phone to buy actual groceries on Saturday. Then he sat at his workbench for a while with the Royal typewriter, not fixing anything, just running his thumb along the keys in the dark. He was at the grant committee meeting on the third Thursday. He brought a folder with 2 years of patient data, neighborhood health metrics cross-referenced with zip code income averages, and a single page of projected outcomes if the Dunmore Clinic secured reliable funding for the next 3 years. Eleanor Marsh was already seated when he arrived. She did not greet him with any more or less warmth than the situation required, which is to say she glanced up, noted his folder with what might have been approval, and returned to her agenda packet. He sat across from her. He made his case. The committee asked good questions, and he gave complete answers. When he was done, Eleanor asked one question he hadn't prepared for, not about the data, but about what happened to the patients once the acute issue was resolved, where they went for maintenance care, what the gaps looked like past the point of his direct involvement. He thought about it honestly and told her he didn't know that part yet, but he intended to find out. That's the right answer, one of the other board members said. After the meeting in the corridor, Eleanor stopped beside him. You'll hear from us in 6 weeks, she said. The timeline is fixed, but I think you should hear good news at the end of it. You can tell me that? I can tell you that the data was compelling, and the committee found your directness refreshing. She paused. Which is what I say to candidates I believe in. Eleanor. Arthur. Would you want to get coffee sometime? He said. Not about the grant, just coffee. She considered him for a moment with the full quality of her attention, which was considerable. I would want that, she said. Third Saturdays I'm usually free by noon. The next third Saturday they had coffee at a place she chose on Clement Street, which turned out to be a small Vietnamese bakery that didn't look like much from outside and was extraordinary inside. They talked for 3 hours. She told him things about the last years of family court that she had never told the journalists who occasionally called. He told her about the year after his wife died, when he'd started the weekend clinic not from altruism, but because Saturday mornings had become untenable, and he needed to be somewhere useful before 9 a.m., or he didn't know what he was going to do with himself. She heard this without flinching, without performing sympathy, and said, "That's how some of the best things get built, out of necessity rather than vision." He thought about that for a long time afterward. They had coffee again the following third Saturday, and the one after that, and eventually it was no longer specifically third Saturdays because that had stopped being the organizing principle. Eleanor came to the Dunmore Clinic one Sunday in February, not to observe or evaluate, but because she'd offered to help sort medical supply donations, which was apparently something she'd done for other organizations and was good at. She was methodical and quick, and when Arthur's volunteer coordinator tried to explain the sorting system, Eleanor had already reverse-engineered it and improved the labeling. "You've done this before," Arthur said. "I've sorted many things," Eleanor said. "Court files, evidence boxes, grant applications, my late husband's library. Categorization is a consistent skill." Her late husband. He'd known there had been someone. She'd mentioned a long-ago marriage and Thomas, the good-at-quality son in Portland. He hadn't asked further, and she hadn't offered more, and this had been the right arrangement. "What was he like?" Arthur asked, not because he needed to know, but because he was curious in the way you're curious about the shape of a life. Eleanor set down the stack of bandage packages she was organizing. She looked at the middle distance for a moment. "Intelligent," she said, "funny in a dry way that sometimes people missed entirely." He was deeply committed to his work and not always present when he was home. She picked up the bandages again. "We were married for 19 years, and I think we genuinely loved each other, and I also think we were better at being colleagues than spouses. He died of a heart attack 6 years ago, which was sudden, and which I am still, in small ways, integrating." "I'm sorry," Arthur said. "Yes," she said. "Me too." They sorted supplies until 3 in the afternoon, and then Eleanor drove herself home, and Arthur sat in the emptied clinic for a while, with the particular quiet that follows useful work, which is its own kind of sound. In April, the grant came through. The full amount, renewable for 3 years. Arthur got the email on a Wednesday morning between patient sessions and stood in the hallway of his practice for longer than was strictly necessary, holding his phone. He called Eleanor. "I heard," she said. "Congratulations. The data was decisive." "Thank you," he said. "For the seat at the table. For the question about continuity care. I've been working on that piece. I know. I've been reading the updates you send the committee. I didn't know you were still on the distribution list. I requested to stay on it," she said. "The Dunmore work is interesting. Eleanor Arthur. Would you like to have dinner?" he said. "Not coffee. Dinner. Something that starts at 7 and has a proper reservation." There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. "Yes," she said. "I would like that." They had dinner at a restaurant that had white tablecloths and was not trying too hard about it, which was a combination Arthur had specifically searched for. He arrived first, which was not a plan but an instinct. Eleanor arrived exactly on time, which he already knew was characteristic, and she'd changed her hair slightly, not dramatically, just arranged differently, and she looked, in the warm light of the restaurant, like someone who had arrived at herself over a long time and was comfortable in the arrival. They talked about everything and nothing in particular. They talked about Portland, about February, about the Royal Typewriter. At one point, Eleanor described an exhibit she'd seen recently at the SF MoMA about architectural drawings, buildings that had been designed and never built, and Arthur said he'd like to see it, and she said she'd go again. And neither of them made it a formal plan, but it became one anyway over the next weeks. He drove her home that night. They stood on the steps of her building, a pleasant building on a quiet street, the kind of building that had been there long enough to feel settled, and she said it had been a very good evening, and he said it had, and they shook hands, which they both recognized as slightly absurd, but neither of them had determined what the alternative was yet, and so they shook hands, and she went inside, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the night air before walking back to his car. On the way home, he thought about what she'd said at the gala the first night, sitting at the table with the 5 empty chairs. that staying home was a decision that got easier every time you made it. He thought about how he'd almost not come. He thought about the coffee-stained RSVP. He thought about his daughter pulling expired soup cans from under the sink with the concentrated energy of someone who loves you enough to alarm you. He thought about the moment he'd crossed the room and asked Eleanor Marsh if anyone was sitting in that chair. He had not known, crossing that room, what he was doing. He had not had a plan or a calculation. He had simply looked at a table that people were avoiding and sat down at it, which was maybe the most honest thing he'd done in longer than he'd want to admit. He wasn't sure when honesty had stopped being his default. He thought it might have happened gradually, the way the soup cans had happened. Not one decision, but an accumulation of smaller, unmade ones, each individually invisible, adding up over time to something you only noticed when someone held it up and showed you the date. He was noticing now. There's a version of this story that ends with a dramatic declaration, something said at the right moment in the right light that crystallizes everything. That's not the version that happened. What happened was more ordinary and more durable than that. Two people in the second half of their lives, having been through the things they'd been through, choosing to show up. Third Saturdays, and then not just third Saturdays. Grant committees and clinic Sundays, and an exhibit at the SF MoMA about buildings that were never built. Phone calls that lasted exactly as long as they needed to, and sometimes longer. Arthur fixed a floor lamp Eleanor mentioned in passing had been giving her trouble. He brought it back in 3 days, working perfectly, and she received it with the particular gravity of someone who recognizes care when it arrives in a practical form. Eleanor read Arthur's continuity care proposal before he submitted it and told him one section was under-argued and which section it was and why, and he rewrote it, and it was better. They were not young. They were not performing anything for anyone. They were two people who had learned the hard way that presence is a choice you make daily, and they were making it, quietly, on ordinary days, which are the only days there actually are. On a Tuesday in June, Eleanor called Arthur at 7 in the morning, which was not their usual time. "Are you busy Saturday?" she said. "I have the clinic until noon. I'm free after noon." "Thomas is in town," she said. "He's here for a conference," I thought. "If you weren't busy, you might want to come to dinner, just dinner. He's easy company." Arthur stood in his kitchen with his coffee, going cold in his hand. "I'd like that," he said. "Good," she said. "He already knows about you. What does he know?" "He knows that you bring data to grant meetings and that you fixed the floor lamp and that you're the reason I stopped drafting grant letters during Galas. That's a lot to know." "He's perceptive," she said. "He comes by it honestly." She hung up, and Arthur stood in the kitchen for a long moment after, in the particular light of early summer, which comes in at an angle in June that is gold and slightly slanted, arriving through the window the way certain things arrive, not announced, not dramatic, just present, and exactly what was needed. He drank his coffee. He was going to be on time to his first appointment. He was going to see Eleanor on Saturday. He thought about the royal typewriter on the workbench in the other room, the one he'd kept. Some things you fix and give away. Some things you fix and find out later that you were fixing them for yourself, that you needed them working, that the repairing wasn't about the object at all, but about the act of choosing, again and again, to restore what's broken instead of letting it sit. He had always known how to do that with lamps and chairs and typewriters. He was learning slowly and without fanfare how to do it with the rest.